Yes.
My son used to be obsessed with those. Really, I mean,
No, they have them in the floater pool downstairs, and they always have snacks. So I'm like, I'll take 7 of them.
and I've just seen, I don't know if it's Sam's Club or Costco because I go to both of them, but one of them has the box of nothing but the brown sugar. I was like, $10.59. FTR is live.
Thank you.
You want to? Okay, perfect. You want to line up the jurors? Are we?
Get the parties. They got to be in first.
No problem. I'll just hang out here. I'll grab them in a minute. Y'all doing okay? Need any water or anything?
Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Okay.
What year was this? 2018 that you did that?
Yes.
Got the coffee brewing, so it might be just a few moments, but
He was like,
I'll
"Once
just
you
bring
bring
it
the
here for it will
coffee
be
in."
hot once I bring it in.
Yeah.
And you said just the black, you don't need anything else inside.
Right. Yeah, I already gonna do that, you know.
Okay to line the jurors up?
Yes, please.
All right.
Thank you. Please be seated. Let the record reflect the presence of our jurors, counsel, as well as the parties. And we do have Dr. Wilson on the line. You may continue with your cross-examination.
Thank you. Dr. Wilson, for the court's understanding, can you explain what causes high blood sugar?
I'm not an endocrinologist, and really that's out of my scope.
Well, it would be what would raise his blood sugar, is what I'm asking. What act would be,
You're asking me as a layman then.
well, yes, you reviewed reports and as expert in dementia and taking in consideration diabetes, I figured you would probably know I thought it was kind of an elementary question, but what causes high blood sugar? Would it be like food or sweets or?
Well, technically it's resistance to insulin or the inability of the body to produce enough insulin. Other things then, such as food or sweets or carbohydrates, can affect people. And what we now know is that different carbohydrates or different types of food affect people differently. So what might send one person's blood sugar skyrocketing might have a minor effect on someone else. So it's a little more complicated than we used to think.
But realistically, in most cases, any type of sugar intake would go up because you had stated earlier that that's where, I think you said it called it a sugar slush would be. When you said Gary's blood sugar was like 18, I think you stated?
Yeah, that was what I recall from the records. Yes, I mean, in an emergency with hypoglycemia, usually, as far as I'm aware, the goal is to jack up the blood sugar as fast as possible. And juices and straight sugar, for example, are absorbed through the system quickly, much faster than foods you have to chew, for example. And therefore, they're going to have an immediate effect on increasing blood sugar. And when you've got someone with severely low blood sugar, hypoglycemia, that's what you want to do, is get it out of that dangerous range as fast as you can.
And
Yes, that's certainly one thing that would increase blood sugar.
what if they were in a normal range and they added sugar? Like,
Depends on the person. You're really asking outside my area.
okay. Okay. If Gary wasn't able to manage finances, who? You said Miss Johansson did for a little while, but then she didn't. You said it was kind of back and forth. Is that correct?
Yes.
Who
That's
would?
that's what I observed, yes.
Who was? If she wasn't handling the finances, who was?
Well, he thought he was.
Was there any information given to you of their utilities being disconnected, or running out of food, or any type of anything being cut off due to the lack of payment of their bills?
She found that a number of bills had not been paid. That was her first indication that he really was not handling things that he said he was handling. And I believe that was in 2015 or 2016. I forget exactly which. But yes, nothing got shut off that I'm aware of. But obviously there were problems when you find a stack of bills that were supposed to have been paid and haven't been.
So a few bills were late paid, basically. What does
I
he?
don't know how many, but enough that it concerned me, yes.
Would a person like Gary be able to perform in a position of a power of attorney?
Would he be someone's power of attorney?
Yes.
Certainly, in my opinion, no, not after 2015 and probably not after 2014. I mean, I think anybody who could appoint him to that role would regret it.
So in 2014, you don't think it would have been a good idea for Gary to have been a power of attorney for his sister and in-law and brother?
No.
Are you aware he was?
Yes.
Are you aware that Mr. Johansson spent 5 days alone in 2015 or 2016 when he flew from Wheaton, Minnesota to Arizona?
Foundation.
I wasn't aware of it, but it doesn't surprise me.
Sustained.
Do you know of any time that Mr. Johansson flew on an airplane by himself?
Foundation.
You have to give it some reference, time frame.
In
How would she have knowledge?
2016, was any of this information given to you about Mr. Johansson being any time alone?
I was not aware that he traveled alone or spent time alone. And that was not in any of the records I reviewed.
Would Mr. Johansson be able to walk down the street on his own in 2018 by himself?
2018?
Yes.
Well, I think he could do it, but perhaps not safely, because by 2018 he had pretty significant problems with gait, with balance. He could walk, but he was really becoming increasingly unsteady. He had frequent falls, so he might do it, but it probably wasn't a great idea to do it unaccompanied.
If he had hit a small thing when walking, would that have caused him to fall? A small object? If he had stumbled on a small object, would that have caused him to fall?
I don't know. It very well might have. One of the things we see with Parkinsonian conditions, whether it's Lewy body or Parkinson's or supranuclear palsy, is people's reflexes, their ability to catch themselves instinctively when they start to lose their balance, is delayed or in some cases almost absent. And so once you trip or start to lose your balance, it's much harder and you are much slower to make a correction. So that's why you tend to see so many increased falls in people with those kinds of diagnoses.
It's,
So, yes, entirely possible he could have stepped over a stone because he didn't have Parkinson's. He had something that's related to it. But he was having more and more falls, and he was having some slowing of gait and gait problems.
and that means basically a lag time from act to reaction, correct?
Not necessarily.
Well, if you said he stumbled over something, he would not react quick enough to recover, correct?
His reflexes would be, I mean, the non-thought part of it, that instinctively you start to self-correct when you lose your balance, that kind of thing would be diminished, and in cases of Parkinson's, often is absent. And so you see more falls. The bradykinesia and the rigidity means that you're moving slowly and more stiffly, and all of those things. I mean, anybody who's ever, worked out really hard and then woke up stiff as could be the next morning knows that, that you have to watch yourself a little more carefully. And if that never goes away, then you have to watch yourself more carefully over time.
What if I told you there was a video of Gary on November 30th, 2018, walking down the street and stumbled on a road reflector and recovered without ever falling? Would that indicate Lewy body or Parkinson?
Objection, foundation.
Overruled. All loud as she can answer.
That wouldn't indicate anything.
Well, which you said the delayed time from reaction. I'm just saying.
Well, I said in Parkinson's, that would be surprising, but he didn't have Parkinson's. Parkinson's affects motor abilities like reflexes much more than it does cognitive abilities until fairly late in the course. Lewy body is the opposite. It has less effect on the physical symptoms and more on the cognitive symptoms. So the fact that he was able to correct himself doesn't surprise me. It doesn't rule out Lewy body. And again, I think fussing over the specific diagnosis is, that's something neuropsychologists and neurologists like to do. Bottom line is, this guy flunked a whole lot of cognitive tests consistently over a period of 3+ years. He had dementia.
Well, I'm just trying to get clear from me and the ladies and gentlemen of the jury here. Because you testified yesterday that basically Gary was pretty much incompetent to accomplish any task or be left alone, to the point of even feeding himself and interesting. And now, well, it's the way it come across. I'm just stating, okay. And basically that. Well, that's what I'm trying to get clarification for on this. And you had mentioned Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and Lewy body yesterday. And now you just stated that if this video was here and Gary walked, it would rule out Parkinson's. Okay, so the difference between Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, you explained yesterday in your testimony. Now it's down to seems Alzheimer's and dementia. So we're narrowing down what could have possibly been. But you've also stated in your testimony yesterday that your diagnosis differs from 2 other clinical psychologists, correct?
Compound,
No,
Your
I
Honor.
said we all three
Sustained.
agreed.
Doctor, that was a compound question. Do you understand the question, or would you like him to rephrase?
Well, it was several questions, and it was based on some incorrect recollections. But let me just address that. I said I agreed with both Dr. Etling and Dr. Powell and with the psychiatrist, Dr. Taylor, that he had Lewy body dementia. And I based that on testing results across the board and on behavioral descriptions. I never said there was a question whether he had Alzheimer's, Lewy body, or Parkinson's. I said they are often seen together, they can overlap, and so that's part of what makes diagnosing a little bit more difficult in a case like this. But the functional effect is the same.
So difficult tasks he would have an extreme issue with. What date would he start having that issue with difficult tasks?
Well, he told Dr. Taylor in October of 2016 he could no longer make phone calls or use his cell phone, that he could no longer reliably use the computer. He was having trouble with what we call the instrumental activities of daily living by October of 2016, and that means, again, somewhat prior to that actual date. And certainly by the time I saw him, he was having more frequent hallucinations. He was not sleeping through the night. Donna was exhausted at that point. He was irritable. Doesn't mean that he wasn't able to throw together a sandwich, but it does mean that leaving him alone to manage his own diabetes was extremely unwise. And again, the notion that he didn't end up in the hospital more often is nothing short of miraculous.
Would he have been able to operate his computer in 2015?
I don't know.
How
But
about,
he didn't complain about it at that point. He complained about it in 2016.
would he have been able to learn new things in 2015?
Yes, his memory was not that bad.
So he would have been able to learn a smartphone, how to operate it, and the many apps that came with it in 2015 and 16?
No, probably not all of them. I mean, that's exactly the kind of complex thing where he may be able to learn and figure out basic things, but the more complicated or unfamiliar it would become, the harder it would be for him to be able to keep track of those things and organize the process. Things that are frequent enough or simple enough to become sort of a habit, he'd certainly be able to learn and continue to do those. Although by 2016, saying he couldn't.
He couldn't in 2016? The video cut.
He told Dr. Taylor that. I have no reason to think he was making it up.
Do you know what type of phone Gary had when you interviewed him?
No, I don't.
Would it have been a smartphone?
I have no idea.
Asked and answered, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Same kind as this.
You stated yesterday that Gary couldn't put a simple cross in a box. Is that correct?
Part of the testing is involved with tests like that, and he was not able to do a copy of a figure that included just a rectangle with a big X in the middle.
And that was in 2018, correct?
That was actually 2017.
Okay.
That was in Dr. Powell's raw testing.
In any of the documentation or anything that was given to you, did you review any depositions of Mr. Johansson or anybody's?
I was given depositions for you and for Nikki, but I skimmed them. I didn't find much of use in them, and I was not given any other depositions.
Was any video provided to you of Mr. Johansson?
No.
Can undue influence apply to anyone that maybe doesn't have the knowledge of a topic?
Can you clarify that just a bit, what you mean?
Well, if someone is knowledgeable on a topic and they're talking with someone who's not, they're talking with someone who's not knowledgeable, can that type of relay of information influence the person that's not knowledgeable on the topic?
Well, it might influence their decision. That's not the same thing as undue influence.
Well,
Undue influence is manipulating or maneuvering or persuading in an inaccurate manner someone to do something that they would not normally do of their own free will, or that is against their own wishes or best interests.
would it be a type of undue influence, for example, a mechanic telling a female, a woman, that her car needs much more repair than what it actually does? Just in
That would probably be fraud, but That's not undue influence,
Well, how is she to know the difference
but it's not undue influence under the law.
if she approved all the work? And is that not some type of influence?
It's not undue influence.
Well, then explain what undue influence is, but you would have to have some type of inability or being incapable or some injury or disability that would make you susceptible?
It's most common when somebody has had either an emotional or other setback, for example, bereavement, but it can also be as someone is just starting to have a little bit of cognitive impairment. They're not able to really check the facts for themselves, and they start relying on someone who does not have their best interests at heart. And so you look for things like a close confidential relationship, excuse me, which I don't think the mechanic probably has. You look for finding ways to either isolate or alienate other sources of information that might run contrary. You find ways to pressure people or to influence their thinking in ways that are not accurate or in their best interests. It's a little more complicated than just deliberately misleading someone so that you can get more money out of them. It's based on a relationship that has not such benign intentions.
In 2018, January 2018, would Gary Johansson be able to sit on the board of directors for a active retirement community?
You sure shouldn't.
Would Gary be able to move out and live independently in January 2018?
You already asked that, and I said he shouldn't, and I don't believe he was capable of doing it.
I was trying.
It doesn't mean that physically he couldn't do it, but he couldn't do it safely.
Was the information given to you that Gary Johansson did move out to Glencroft in January 2018?
I knew that he briefly separated from his wife. What I was told was that he was going to be with his sister. I did not know that he moved to Glencroft, but I also know that it didn't last very long. He and Donna got back together, and by the time I saw them, neither of them acknowledged that there had been a separation.
It was more than 2 weeks separation. He lived alone. Are you aware? Did they give you that information?
They did not.
Glencroft, do you know what type of home it is?
Yes. It has assisted living, and there's several levels. Care.
Is it active living or is it assisted living?
I think they have multiple levels of care.
Do you know what the advertisement is for Glencroft in Glendale, Arizona?
Not anymore. I used to go out there to see people, which is why I know that they had there. You had the ability to get specialized care, or you could hire a nursing service, for example, to provide special care.
Would it be normal for a person with the condition you state to rent a unit on the second floor to have to negotiate stairs on a daily basis?
It would not be wise, but most of those places have elevators because they do have elderly clients.
Do you know if Glencroft has elevators?
I don't know for a fact, but I'd be surprised if they didn't.
Okay. You stated in your report a couple of things here on page 2.
Which exhibit, please?
It's Exhibit 88.
Thank you.
Page 2.
Yes. Paragraph 3.
All right.
It says that you had received the Adult Protective Services
It has
filed?
to be a question. You can't just read to her.
What does that state in paragraph 3, Dr. Wilson?
I reviewed the Adult Protective Services file for the investigation into allegations of exploitation by Nick Casvelli against Gary Johansson, which was closed on 04/11/18. Should I continue?
No. Why would an adult investigation be closed?
Oh, any number of reasons. Because there are lawyers involved, that almost always leads to a prompt closure. Adult Protective Services considers its job to look at people who are being abused, exploited, or neglected, or unable to care for themselves. As soon as lawyers or even interested family step in, they will usually close out that case because they are so overloaded, and they're not going to step in the way of court proceedings. So by that time, there already was lawyers involved and threats of litigation. That would be one reason to close it. Another reason would be because they thought they had complete information and didn't see that the problems that were described existed. That doesn't mean they had the accurate information, however.
What would cause an investigation to be opened?
Someone has to complain, typically. Someone has to say, this person can't care for themselves, or this person is signing things left and right for a neighbor or what have you, and I have reason to be concerned. And they will investigate. Obviously, they put cases where there's some concern about physical damage or abuse first, but they also look into financial cases.
So would a lawsuit like this one cause an investigation from Adult Protective Services being filed?
No. If someone filed a lawsuit and they knew it, typically they would stay out of it. But if someone called and said, I have these concerns and was not aware that there was a lawsuit filed already, then they would begin the investigation. And once they found out that lawyers were involved, they would probably do what they needed to do to close the case appropriately.
Are you aware that in Arizona, the vulnerable law that's ARS 12459 or 455, I forget which exact, that when someone alleges financial exploitation, that they are required to give the Attorney General a copy of the complaint?
I'm sorry, when someone files,
Any complaint alleging financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, that they are required to give a copy to the Attorney General's office?
I think I knew that, but I'm not sure who is responsible. I mean, if the case is filed, I know that those sorts of things also have to go to the Attorney General, but APS investigations don't necessarily.
Would the Attorney General then refer it to Adult Protective Service for investigation of those allegations?
Objection, Foundation, Your Honor.
Sustained.
I don't know what direction that would go, but
Dr. Wilson, Dr. Wilson.
That objection sustained, so you don't have to answer. You have to lay the foundation that she would have this knowledge. How would this neuropsychologist have this knowledge?
Would you have the knowledge as if a complaint like this was filed in this litigation and being copied to the Attorney General's office, what they would do with it after receiving the complaint?
no, I do not.
You would not have any clue why it would even be copied to the Attorney General?
That's not what I said. I said I don't know what would happen once it was copied to the Attorney General. I have seen cases where the Attorney General weighed in and decided to take it over. I've seen cases where the Attorney General declined to get involved. So I don't know what their rules or procedures are.
Was you given the results of the investigation by Adult Protective Services?
Yes.
And what did they determine?
They determined that there were attorneys involved and they could defer to that they didn't see obvious signs of exploitation on the basis of the information that they had, but that information was incomplete and they looked in the wrong place for some of the information. So I think they closed it primarily because lawyers were already involved in reviewing the exploitation. And that is, having worked with them many times, that is their standard. Lawyers are involved, they want out.
Did the determination state succinctly as they did not substantiate any exploitation?
I believe it did say that they did not find substantiation.
You stated in your report, same page, on page 2, paragraph 5. Could you read that, please?
What's the question that you have for her?
The question is, she's made how did you determine this statement in your report about the Cassavellis?
Some of it was from Donna Johansson. Some of it may have come from the filings in the court to that point, the assorted, Rule 26 disclosure statements, because I read those also. But I don't doubt that some of it came from Donna Johansson.
Well, excuse me, what disclosure statements did you read?
I typically try to read the disclosure statements from both sides because that gives me a layout of what both sides are claiming and also how they present the pattern for the course of events. And so I do look at those. And it may very well have been, at least partly, from those statements that the basic timeline was established.
Can you define what your reference to a spotty history of self-employment means?
That must have come from one of the disclosure statements, but the notion that rather than having one continuous career, that you and your wife had gone from one job for a while to another, as opposed to, for example, always being a retail clerk or always being a, mechanic, what have you.
Could it be possible that there were gainful employment at the same time of being self-employed?
I'm not saying there wasn't gainful employment.
I'm trying.
I didn't say self-employed. I said spotty, meaning inconsistent or broken, periodic gainful employment as opposed to a continuous career.
I quote you, the Cassavellis had a spotty history of self-employment. I'm trying to ask you how you come to that determination. Through reports, you say, or disclosure statements?
Probably would have been disclosure statements and Donna Johansson.
Did you ever speak to the Cassavellis?
I did not.
In person, in phone, interview, nothing?
No.
Sorry. On page 11, paragraph 7 in your report,
Mm-hmm.
did anyone ever accuse the Cassavellis of doing something against Mr. or Ms. Johansson that was reported to you?
Well, as this paragraph notes, when Donna was telling me about having left the house unattended with the workman there and having, for some reason, left her purse there and lost her wallet, she, at one point she was distraught, not very coherent, all over the place. And at one point, she did say it was probably the, Nick and Nikki, but then she went on and said, but no, I'm sure it was the workman. So yeah, she was pretty angry, and she did accuse you and or your wife of going in when the house was untended.
You were given information when this lawsuit was filed against us, correct, Casvellis? You were given information when this litigation right here was filed against the Casvellis, correct?
I think it was quite some time after it was filed. I was first involved in June or July of 2018.
She specifically named Nick Casvelli when you
She may
spoke
have
with
said, she usually called you Nick and Nikki as opposed to the Casabellas when I spoke to her.
So the allegation was,
And she took it back almost immediately.
well, I understand that according to your report, but the allegation was against both myself and Nicolina Castelli.
As far as I'm aware, yes, that's the way it sounded from what she told me.
Okay. Mr. Easton mentioned to you yesterday that something about a $127,000 check. Do you have knowledge of that check?
I know that it was money that was given over for the Aspire LLC in, I think, January of 2017.
When was the last time you received information from Mr. Easton or the Johansons in regard to this litigation and your testimony here?
I haven't talked or had any contact with the Johansons since probably September or October of 2018. Mr. Easton sent me some records that I already had, but that were Bates stamped this past week. I don't believe I've gotten anything new other than the complete APS report, and that was sometime maybe as much as a year ago.
What was the documents he sent you?
I've been pretty much out of so fairly recent.
What documents did he send you previously, recently?
He sent me the Bates stamped, now I'm going to find it. He sent me exhibits 53, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67, 85, 88, and 89. And again, those have been Bates stamps, which for the jury is a little set of running numbers at the bottom of the documents. And the ones I had received in 2018 were not Bates stamped. So this makes these the more official court records.
These exhibits?
These exhibits. And all of these were documents that I previously had seen.
Mr. Johansson, you stated was under Dr. Peter Taylor's care at one point?
Yes, in October 2016 through maybe March of 2017 or thereabouts.
What profession is Dr. Taylor?
Dr. Taylor is a psychiatrist, and he's with the Banner Specialty Clinic for dementias. It used to be the Banner Alzheimer's Clinic, and then it got somebody's name, and then it got somebody else's name.
What would he have been seeing Gary for depression?
He was part of the dementia workup team. And as I mentioned yesterday, many of their psychiatrists had neurological training, and many of their neurologists had psychiatric training. And the top guys at the clinic are neuropsychiatrists, which is a blend of the two. His degree was in psychiatry, but he was diagnosing dementia as opposed to depression. He was the person that was asked to look at all the neurological, psychiatric, and functional information and pull together a firm diagnosis.
Do you know how many visits Mr. Johansson had with Dr. Taylor?
There were, I want to say maybe 4 or 5 between October and when Dr. Taylor left the Banner system in April of 2017.
Okay.
May have only been 4. And then he started being seen by the nurse practitioner, Marina Reed.
And you said he was a psychiatrist. Is it normal for a psychiatrist to deal with dementia?
Yes. And again, in a clinic, in a specialty clinic, you are dealing with people who are neuropsychiatrists. They specialize in the same way there are neuropsychologists who are clinical psychologists who specialize in brain-behavior relationship. Neuropsychiatrists are psychiatrists by degree, if you will, but they are trained in neuropsychiatry, which is brain-behavior relationships from a psychiatric or medical perspective. So, yes, in any kind of specialty dementia clinic, you will find neuropsychiatrists like Dr. Taylor.
In January of 2017, would Gary Johansson have been able to maintain a 20-minute conversation and stay on topic?
Probably.
Would he have known what he was discussing at that time?
Yes, I mean, I'd be surprised if he was able to keep a really coherent track, but he may have been able to do that for periods of time.
Would that then make him?
Go ahead.
Would that make him susceptible at that time, or would it make him not susceptible, or
Irrelevant. It's irrelevant to his susceptibility.
well, vulnerability then? If he's able to hold a 20-minute conversation and stay on topic, would he be considered vulnerable?
He might still be vulnerable, yes, because vulnerability means you're not able to protect yourself from exploitation. It doesn't say that you can't carry on a conversation.
What if the conversation? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
People who are vulnerable are not necessarily incapacitated, but they are not able to look out for their own welfare, their own financial welfare, and they may think they are. They may sound good, but they are still vulnerable. So having a 20-minute conversation is irrelevant to that determination.
What if it's a conversation about being vulnerable?
What about it?
The Johanssons had a conversation with their attorney, Mr. Easton. Well, he wasn't their attorney at the time, but they had a conversation with him for over 20 minutes on the topic of exploitation, vulnerability, and it's...
Objection, Your Honor, he's testifying.
No, was the conversation given to you that was recorded by the Johanssons on January 23rd, 2017 to review?
No. No.
No audio recordings was given to you?
No.
Okay. Would they have been cognitive enough, both of them, to have a conversation about vulnerability in January 2017?
Yes.
No. Yes.
Yes. Doesn't mean that their opinions or judgments were correct. Doesn't mean they would have walked away and really understood in any level of depth what had been discussed. But yes, they could carry on conversations.
So,
Tangential, I'm sure, but conversations nonetheless.
if they didn't have the ability to hold a conversation about vulnerability in January, would they have had the cognitive ability to file a lawsuit 10 months later? And understand it.
I didn't follow that.
if they're not cognitive enough or aware in January 2017, but they can hold a conversation, 10 months later, advancing in September of 2017, would they have been lucid enough to understand what they are doing by filing a lawsuit?
Well, I think Donna certainly had no cognitive impairment, so I think she could have understood, at least on a as well as anyone else, probably any other layperson, why she needed to do this and what was going to be involved. Gary certainly would have considered himself able to make that decision.
Dr. Wilson,
You're finished.
go ahead, finish, please.
No, go ahead.
You've testified that at one point in time, Gary cannot do something, but then you state he can, and I'm confused. Then at the same point in time, you state he's not capable of doing it, but then you state he did do it. Your testimony is conflicting against itself, and I'm just wondering, why is it at some point in time he's okay, and other point in times he's not okay, but it's the same relevant time frame?
Objection, misstates testimony, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Why would he be able to be cognitive at one point, say January of 17, and then at another time he's not cognitive in January at the same relevant time? But yet you state...
The word cognitive has no meaning in the way that you're using it.
Then
Carry on a conversation. That's not saying that he was cognitively intact, because he wasn't. But he could carry on. I mean, we have people with advanced Alzheimer's who can carry on conversations, but the extent to which they really are able to process that or retain it is very poor. He would probably remember pieces, but he would not be able to see the deeper meaning of things or the implications of things. But he would probably sound at the time like he was following. That doesn't mean he was cognitively intact. I think you need to understand that he had brain damage. The brain damage didn't go away from day to day. It worsened steadily from 2014 on, and we have documentation of that from 2015 on. It wasn't like one day his memory or his visual perceptual abilities cleared up and then the next day they were back down. It was steady. He might have days when he was a little sharper than others because of attention or because of his diabetes being under better control.
So at any given...
The brain damage was there.
So at any given time, say 2016, he could have been misled to do anything?
Not necessarily anything. Again...
Let me rephrase that question, please. In 2016, he could have been misled to do anything by a trusted source?
Again, I wouldn't say anything, but I would say he could be easily led to do things that would not be in his own interests, and he would not necessarily realize that, or could be misled in a way that he wouldn't see that that was an outcome.
Isn't that...
No, I mean, if you said drive that car into a stone wall, I don't think you could persuade him to do that.
Well, aren't you testifying that he has cognitive abilities to decide what's good and bad then? That he's not so lost in dementia that he doesn't perceive his surroundings? Is that what I'm understanding that you're stating?
I never did that. I never implied that. Of course he's aware of his surroundings. I mean, his memory was pretty good. His ability to converse was pretty good. That was documented in the testing. But his ability to keep track of information, to analyze it, to problem solve, to reason, to be able to keep two different ideas in mind and compare them, for example, or go back to one or the other and say, yeah, I see the strengths or weaknesses. All of those things were significantly limited.
Was you given Gary's educational history as part of your...
Yes, his master's degree in education, I believe.
Gary was a smart man, correct?
Pardon me?
Gary was a smart man, correct?
He had an average IQ.
To hold a master's degree is an average IQ? I'm just asking.
Yeah, it is. I mean, average is a fairly broad range. I didn't see anything in the testing that suggested he was ever high average. He may have been on the upper end of the average range, but his IQ is average, and many people get masters with average IQs. There are physicians with average IQs, believe me.
So wouldn't decline from a higher average take a little longer to get to the decay that you've testified to? Or would it come on
Well,
sudden?
I'm not saying high average. I'm saying he was average. And it is generally true that people who have a higher level of intellectual ability or just a high level of education often take longer in the earlier stages to manifest cognitive impairment. That doesn't mean it's not happening. It may mean that they're covering better or that they have a little bit more resilience, but it doesn't prevent the deterioration over time, and it doesn't change what you find on testing, other than you've got to make sure that you score correctly to keep education in mind.
Well, you mentioned that putting an X in a box earlier. If a person didn't have good vision, could that affect that task as well?
Not to the extent or in the way that his impairment manifested. If a person had severely impaired vision, first of all, we wouldn't give them tests like that. We would give them non-visual tests. But there was nothing anywhere in the medical records or in his behavior to indicate that vision per se was a problem. He was able to see other things, but he was not able to manipulate or do visual and spatial things.
How about something as arthritis? Could that affect his ability to put an X in a box?
Not that badly. It might have been, I mean, someone with a tremor might have trouble doing a neat job of it, but they would still be able to approximate it, and you'd recognize rectangle and X. And he wasn't even able to do that.
For my clarification then, a person has to be in such decline that they can't pick up a pen and put an X in a box, and that would be caused by the dementia, because he doesn't understand to pick up the pen and make an X, or just because he can't? I'm trying to figure this.
Okay, I'll try to clarify. Lewy body dementia and Parkinson's and all that class of illnesses affects the ability of the brain to process visual perception. When we get stuff and light coming in from the eyes, our brains are reinterpreting it, making shapes and forms and so on. That starts to deteriorate early in these conditions that have a Parkinson's component to them. And the ability then to manipulate spaces, for example, block puzzles or jigsaw puzzles, or being able to draw a clock, or in this case, being able to copy a design, become significantly impaired. One of the reasons we suspect something like Lewy body dementia instead of Alzheimer's is because people with Lewy body dementia deteriorate rapidly and more severely in these nonverbal areas, whereas people with Alzheimer's may be able to draw that design even when their memory is really, really bad. So it's that pattern of mental strengths and weaknesses that show us which direction we should be looking for diagnosis. So he could pick up the pencil and he could draw, for example, a really bad oval, and he could write a couple of numbers in, but not in the right places, or in the right general places, but not laid out the way you or I might be able to do a clock. But he couldn't set the time. He couldn't draw the hands to make the time the way he was supposed to. That's the brain. That's not something that's motoric. And so even more complicated or involved visual and perceptual abilities were deteriorated as well. That's why his visual memories was so bad.
So an audible directive of sign your name on the line, he would be able to achieve that task?
Yes. That's a highly overlearned thing. I mean, one of the things I look at is how people's signatures change over time. And if you look at his writing, he was beginning to show perseveration. For example, multiple extra loops on an N or an M, even in his signature by 2016, 2017. But changes in signature come fairly late in most cases. And that's not the same thing as being asked to draw something or to copy something or to remember something visual that you haven't seen before.
Were you provided with Gary's last will and testament?
I don't recall.
So you're stating that repetitive signing is neurologically processed, but something that's out of the ordinary, like drawing X in a box, doesn't process.
I'm saying that something that's familiar and overlearned, like your signature, I mean, that holds up pretty well in dementia until really what we call graphomotor problems, hand-eye coordination, those sorts of things. And I know by 2016, when Dr. Taylor saw him, that he was having trouble with what we call praxis, which is mentally instructing movement. So the way you test for that is something like, show me if you had a key, how you would open a lock. And the person's supposed to go, like that, turn it. And there's a variety of, show me how you would strike a match to light it, those sorts of things. And Dr. Taylor noted that he was starting to have difficulty with those kinds of tasks, with mentally reconstructing movement. That's pretty serious. And again, that's an indication that visual and motor abilities were deteriorating much more rapidly than language or memory.
I have makes one other question. Basically, you're stating that it was difficult for Gary to understand, put an X in a box, so he couldn't play a game like tic-tac-toe. But he could sign his name to a legal document, filing a lawsuit, selling a car, and enter into a contract. Am I understanding that correctly? Because it was repetitive?
The process of signing and the signature is a repetitive thing. So he could sign on any dotted line that he was told to sign on or that he wanted to sign on. Doesn't mean that he knew what he was signing, but he knew he was signing his signature, and he was able to do that at that point. But what he couldn't do was draw a clock or copy a design or something that involved, like reading a map, for example. It involves a part of the brain that uses only visual and spatial information and direction and things that we take for granted. That's the area of the brain that was affected first.